Yes, so the webinar will be recorded. I hope everybody is okay with that. And our presenters, as I mentioned, are Dominic Scott and Michael Hogan from the Regulatory Assistance Project. And just a brief on our speakers today. In no particular order, we'll start with Mike Hogan. He focuses on power market design and integration of low carbon supply, system planning and demand response at RAP. And he splits his time between RAP US and Europe teams. He has previously directed programs promoting the full decarbonization of European power supply for the European Climate Foundation. And he has a really long stretching experience. Before RAP, he has done several things. He has marketed power plant equipment and services at General Electric. He has helped build several companies, one of them being JMC, that is the J. McCoskey Company, which is a leading US private power developer. And he's also helped build an Intergen, which is also a private power developer, which has global projects. And he's on the advisory board of the REC Foundation in Budapest. And this foundation aims to support the formation of sustainable energy systems in Central Europe. He has a master's degree in business administration from the Harvard University and a master's degree in planning from MIT. He also has a bachelor's in philosophy and aerospace engineering from the University of Notre Dame. So great experience you see there. Our second speaker as well, that's Dominic Scott. His work at RAP focuses on the power sector, including demand response and market reform, and maximizing the potential of clean energy for all Europeans package. He has a very wide experience in energy and environmental regulation and policy from public, private, and academic sectors. He's an economist, and he has degrees from London School of Economics, Trinity College in Dublin, among others. He, as I said, his experience is drawn from different sectors. He has lectured as well in energy economics and policy at the University of Reykjavik in Iceland. He's also given advice to Icelandic utilities and the Institute of Economic Studies. He's worked with the British Civil Society in the Ministry of Energy, the Competition Authority, with the energy regulator there, Ofgem. And at Ofgem, he has participated in several things, including several of the working groups there. And yes, he's also worked with the Transparency International on global initiatives to promote transparency in targeted sectors. So as you can see, we have a wealth of knowledge here and experience, and we are happy to have them on board, especially being the authors of this toolkit. And we are happy to engage with you, Dominic and Michael, on this. And the subject today is very important for us as the platform of action for renewables and CAN. Those reasons have already been communicated. The subject of grid management is very key for us. It's the foundation to solving once and for all this issue of grid outage. And at the webinar today, we're looking forward to some of these myths, long-standing myths being busted with proper case studies, proper evidence. And yeah, I will hand it over to Mike and Dominic in whatever order that they're prepared to take us through the toolkit. And yes, after that, we'll have a question and answer session and we'll engage further. So thank you, Dominic and Mike, and over to you.
Right. Thank you, Janet. I'll kick it off. So if you throw up the slides, that would be great.
Sorry.
Okay. So good day, everyone, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. This toolkit, as we're calling it, was something we were asked to put together, and we were happy to do so in the wake of some recent events, which not surprisingly were immediately followed by what you see here, which is the first key message from the exercise, which is that there is almost inevitably an organized promotion of false narratives in the aftermath of these high-profile outages that promotes the idea that they were caused by, that where there is any significant growth in variable renewable generation as a supply source on the grid, that was the cause, that we can't rely on these things, that they are compromising the reliability of the bulk power system, blah, 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 blah. And, so it's no accident that this comes out very quickly, and sometimes within an hour or two of the news first emerging that there's been a major event. And they persist quite aggressively for days, even well before any real data or reliable information has been released about what happened, why it happened, and what could be done about it. So there was a feeling, which was the reason behind doing this, that the clean energy advocacy community needed better tools to be able to counter that narrative in real time. And as the title of the presentation and the toolkit says, this is meant to be a rapid response toolkit. It's not a treatise on long-term what the impact of renewables is likely to have on the reliability of power systems, or a technical treatise on what you would do about it. It's really to try to give advocates access quickly to some tools and some information that they can use to provide kind of authoritative and well-founded counter narratives to the usual suspects. And one of the key messages that comes out, and certainly we've heard this also as a request from Stefan Singer, and it is simply the case that in all of the power outages that we've looked at, major high-profile power outages in grids with a high share of renewables over the past few years, certainly, as with all power outages, major power outages, they have complex causes. But first of all, nearly all of them are in the first instance due to failures in the transmission and distribution infrastructure. And when I say nearly all, I mean we'll see shortly. It's 90% or more. And where there have been major events in high renewables grids, and almost in every instance, they could have been mitigated by application of industry and regulatory best practice in grid management. In other words, basically not much has changed. Things happen, nobody's perfect. And as has been the case with bulk power systems for 75 years or more, sometimes the carefully laid plans of grid managers go awry. And that's always happened at a very, very low rate of frequency. There have been several recent events that were precipitated in the first instance by a shortfall in available production, which again is typically immediately and persistently attributed to renewables. And yet in every one of those instances, the cause was overwhelmingly the failure of thermal generation, coal, gas, and nuclear, not renewables. It is worth remembering, however, that while at the moment, and certainly for the foreseeable future, we can operate high renewables grids for up to levels as high as anybody is anticipating for the next 10 to 15 years reliably. At the moment, some of the measures that we have to employ do involve things that many of us find distasteful. For instance, the recent winter storm Elliott in the Northeast over Christmas, 2 days before Christmas. In ISO New England, they were able to come through the event without having to curtail any firm load, despite very heavy losses in their thermal generating fleet. One of the ways they did that was being able to burn oil in their gas-fired combined cycle plants. That's unfortunate, but it is the low-cost solution for consumers right now. And while we're working towards solutions that can offer us clean and equitable alternatives, we're not there yet. But the bottom line is that reliability does not need to be compromised and should not be compromised by growth in renewables. So Dominic will take the next slide, please.
Right. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yep.
Yep. Great. So quick introduction, sort of overview of the toolkit. So it includes an introduction to the important parties and their roles in managing the electricity system. A major one there, of course, is the system operator, who was like a traffic cop of the electricity highway. And this traffic cop ensures that demand and supply are balanced at every moment, because it's rather difficult to store electricity at the moment. And its job is maintaining frequency in the electricity current, which alternates on the major electricity network. And it's got resources it uses for this purpose, like power plants, but it can also turn down demand at for instance, big industrial plant that have the flexibility to do so. And if necessary, they can order sequential involuntary interruptions to groups of customers for limited periods of time. And the idea being that if you do that, you can keep control of the network and you don't have an entire blackout across the whole network, and you can thereby protect critical demands such as those in hospitals. It also outlines technical concepts like inertia, which is basically, historically, it's been provided by large heavy machines at power plants and industrial plants that are synchronized with the frequency of the electricity current and mechanically slow rates of decline in the electricity frequency and help the system operator to keep demand and supply balanced. And the challenges that are presented as we displace these old plant with new wind and solar ones. Second, it unpacks different types of reliability event, their cause and consequences. So different types include local distribution wire failures. It could be rolling interruptions of service from the transmission network. It could be entire blackouts where the whole network goes dark, which is pretty much the worst case scenario. And in terms of causes, well, Mike's talked about problems with wires. It could be the system operator itself has failed in some way and really ought to have done a better job and has lost control. It could be inadequate generation. And it introduces the various consequences, which I guess we're all familiar with: inconvenience, threat to public health, price spikes, and it shows how these link to different types of events, with the most severe consequences in case of blackouts. Third off, it provides an interactive checklist for advocates to analyze emerging reliability events. So this helps to understand the true causes of the reliability event, which is helpful in pushing back against myths and misinformation that are being shared. And it looks at the event background, the demand and supply situation, the weather, the plan that the system operator had for dealing with eventualities, and how those plans rated against what actually happened. So it provides a framework that the advocates can use to debunk claims of parties that are seeking to blame renewables for reliability events. And we use this checklist in relation to the Texas event, the Great Freeze in Texas of 2021, to show how it can be applied in anger. Fourth, the toolkit offers forensic analyses of 4 recent high-profile case studies. identifying causes, contributing factors, and mitigations. They show how quickly events can unfold, how quickly the fossil fuel lobby, if you like, can pin the blame on renewables. And really, in all cases, it shows that the role of renewables in these events was pretty negligible. And we'll go into more detail on these shortly. Finally, it offers suggested holding lines for advocates during the information vacuum that typically happens in the immediate aftermath of a reliability event. And the key one being that history has shown us the vast majority of supply losses stem from problems with wires, chiefly at distribution grids. And in the past, people have been quick to blame renewables, but it really hasn't been borne out by the facts and by a dispassionate analysis. Could we have the next slide, please, Janet? So here we have a picture of the Power Outage Rapid Response Toolkit. The 4 photographs linked to our 4 case studies. So we've got Texas in the snow. We have the beautiful green fields of Britain. The bottom right are the wildfires in California, which I guess puts the lightning as South Australia. And you have the link there to the paper. I think it's about 25 pages long. And I'm now going to pass back to Mike.
Okay, so we won't spend a lot of time on this slide. It basically illustrates the point that that was made already, which is that that in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, customers losing power is the result of problems with the transmission and/or distribution wires. This is just a representative sample of U.S. experience. Customer electric outages between 2013 and 2016. No significance to that selection of time period. This was put together in 2017 in response to some things going on from, yes, you guessed it, the fossil fuel industry. What this slide shows is that the blue bars is customer outage minutes from all causes, including major events. Green bars are customer outages from events excluding major events, so like hurricanes and so on and so forth. And the orange bars are the outages that are attributable to a loss of power supply to the distribution system. So basically a failure of the bulk power system to deliver energy to the distribution system operators or suppliers. And what you can see, of course, is that in 80 to 90% of the instances, the problem had to do with actually problems with the distribution system. The orange bars include a whole a half dozen or more causes, including problems with the transmission system, problems with excessive power outages at power plants, extreme weather, problems with the fuel supply system, so on and so forth. So the number of customer power losses due to some problem with the mix of generating resources is vanishingly small in all of these instances. Next slide, please.
This is me.
This is you.
Okay, just in case you're going to fight me over it. So we had 4 case studies that we picked. We picked them because they're high profile, some more than others. Texas, obviously, extremely high profile with as many 200 deaths linked to that event. Because we picked them because they're recent. We picked them because the fossil fuel lobby was quick in each instance to point the finger of blame at renewables, and we picked this because this turned out to be, surprise, surprise, unfair. Now, The first event stemmed from a storm in Australia in 2016, which destroyed transmission lines and led to system blackouts. The photographs of the aftermath and the impact of the storm are, quite gobsmacking. Now, a couple of problems led to the situation spinning beyond control because the storm was expected. First off, there were low levels of there were high levels of wind, and there was low inertia on the system. And so why was the low inertia? I mean, it ultimately could have been prepared for by the system operator, who was aware a storm was coming, by ensuring procuring inertia, either by getting more thermal plant online to deal with unexpected eventualities, or by procuring other forms of inertia. So that's, if you like, a planning or regulatory problem. Another problem that led to it spiraling out of control was that some of the generation plant had settings that were very sensitive to changes in the system frequency. And when the system frequency changed with the lightning strike on the transmission wires, that they then shut down prematurely, and then things, there was a cascading problem. Now, these plants happen to be wind plant, but it could have been any plant. And the problem really was a lack of oversight here. So in this example, the Deputy Prime Minister was very quick to jump onto the airwaves and immediately link it to renewables. But it's also a good example in that there were some clean energy advocates who were very quick to counteract this, including Michael Slezak, who's the Guardian Australia, I think, was he Environment or Australian editor, one of the two. The second event links to a lightning strike in Britain, and just in the interest of time, I'm not really going to spend long on this. It's rather similar, in fact, to this South Australian one. The Daily Mail was very quick to publish the view of an energy, what they called an energy expert, who blamed wind as the culprit. RAP, my organization, managed to publish a paper dispelling myths. It took about a month to get the necessary information out there. So, that also talks to the difficulties in addressing these narratives, during the information vacuum. But it also, I guess, points to the importance of having holding lines in the interim and getting those out. The third event was in California in 2020, when there was record-breaking heat. There were wildfires. There was growing penetration of solar, which required proactive planning by a system operator. And obviously, it's well known at what time the sun will set. During the summer, the system operator had to involuntarily curtail some demand on a couple of days to keep control of the system. Now, a dispassionate analysis of it actually suggests that this can't really be attributable to demand being dramatically exceeding forecasts, or attributable to a shortage of investment in generation resources, or problems with variable renewable resources. Ultimately, it was down to poor planning by the system operator. Nevertheless, President Trump was quick to seize on the event as evidence that green policies, as pushed by the Democrats, were leaving Americans in the dark. And now the LA Times was pretty quick to push back on some of the misinformation. So that one's probably, again, poor planning by the system operator, or planning that could be better, is a clear driver to examine in the aftermath. The final one was the event in Texas in 2021. There was an extreme freeze that hit Texas, which they, I guess, weren't really expecting. They were imagining their peak demand would happen in summer, when air conditioning would be on. Rather, what happened was it was extremely cold. People started turning to electricity resistive heating, not least as there was colossal failure on the gas infrastructure and gas upstream, and that meant had implications for heat, and it meant that the electricity system was impacted with failure of gas fired generation, electricity generation plant. The contribution of renewables was minor, and yet you saw straight away Fox very quick to push the narrative that freezing wind turbines were to blame. Mike, my colleague, got a piece out within 2 weeks, starting to set the record straight, but at the same time with inadequate information. So a common theme of the case studies is that recent major events in grids could have been mitigated by application of best practice by the industry in terms of regulation and planning. There is no reason for growing penetration of renewables, including variable renewables, to threaten reliability, but the key is best practice and learning lessons. So back to you, Mike.
Right. I mean, just to illustrate that point, the California case that Dominic pointed to, in the aftermath, the CEO of CalISO, which is the independent system operator for the California system, was quoted as saying that the cause of the problem, the cause of the event was, quote, a lack of putting all the pieces together. You have to rethink these old ways of doing things, and that's what didn't happen. And that's the system operator themselves, fessing up to the fact that these are mitigable events. They just need to do a better job of figuring out where the system is headed. And of course, it's important to note that that there will be challenges this is a major transformation of the power system, and to think that there won't be challenges going forward is perhaps a bit naive. But we've seen in every one of these incidents that these challenges are manageable, and we're learning as we're going along. And they do not constitute any excuse to slow down the transition. So the final slide before we open it up for questions is just to distill some common themes from these four case studies. One is that in most of these cases, the precipitating event really comes down to what has been referred to as extreme weather. But of course, as many of us have observed recently, what constitutes extreme when it comes to weather is something we need to revisit. These extreme events, which are often characterized as 100-year storms or once in 100-year events, are now coming once a decade or more, or even more frequently. And planners are way behind the curve on this. And it's hard to point to any system operator anywhere in the world that has yet done a very good job of updating their planning processes to account for the much more frequent occurrence of what were once considered extreme weather events. And we see that repeatedly in these events. In terms of contributing events, especially where there was some contribution from the renewable suppliers on the system, the fact is that several of these incidents have illustrated a very high and very growing dependence on a very vulnerable natural gas supply and transport system. That was clearly the case in Texas. It was clearly the case, it's been clearly the case in Europe over the past year. It was clearly the case in a case study that we didn't do because it's very, very recent, which is Winter Storm Elliott in the eastern US. We're seeing the natural gas supply and transport system failing, including gas-fired combined cycle plants, failing at a shockingly high rate in some of these events, which leads to the second common theme, contributing events, which is that thermal generating fleets, and I would throw hydro in there as well, are a lot less firm and dispatchable than we often hear about. One of the little remarked upon contributors to the European energy crisis this past year, it has rightfully been largely attributed to the interruptions occasioned by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, but much less remarked upon is the fact that a very large share of the French and Belgian nuclear fleets have been offline. and a very large share of normal hydroelectric production in Europe has been unavailable because of drought. Again, we're seeing, the failure rate among thermal generators in the eastern US during Winter Storm Elliott over the Christmas period was shocking. PJM, the largest independent system operator in the world, lost 45% of their generating fleet due to weather freezing related problems, combination of plant failures and fuel supply failures. And almost all of that was fossil-fired thermal generation, virtually all of it. A third common theme, contributing factors, and Dominic touched on this, is poor or out of anachronistic planning assumptions, poor implementation of operating processes relative to industry best practice. And we didn't talk about this in the run through, but in several cases, there are plans in place for controlled curtailment of load as a way to maintain the stability of the system. And in a couple of these cases, those plans just went completely off the rails. There's no excuse for that. And then finally, for various reasons, in several of these cases, system operators simply just got the load forecast wrong, and significantly so. And that probably has links to the problems with weather forecasting, but also with ways in which suppliers have been incentivized to game the system as planning and operation becomes a bit more complex. As far as involvement of variable renewables, in many cases, there really was no material involvement at all. And where there was some involvement, it's clearly mitigable with better practice on the part of industry and system operators and regulators. And those mitigation strategies across these cases include stronger and better grid codes. The Australia case was a classic example of that, South Australia, and better code enforcement. The UK case was a great example of that. Long term, we just simply have to reduce our vulnerability to fossil fuel supply, transport, and thermal generation failure vulnerabilities. As we've moved away from coal and to some extent nuclear, and we've moved quickly, which is great, but it's left us vulnerable to the fact that for some period of time we've had to increase our reliance on natural gas, which is not traditionally a fuel and a technology that the power system has heavily relied upon. And as we've moved more and more towards our short-term vulnerability to problems with the natural gas supply and transport systems, we've come to realize that they're not really all that reliable, despite whatever the gas industry might like to say. Third, and again, in several of these cases, strengthening interregional interconnection and cooperation and integration is critical. The Texas event was a great example of that. But we also see the value of more regional, stronger regional, interregional interconnections and stronger interregional real-time operation of the power grid as an essential feature. And the California case was a great example of that. And finally, and these are universal themes across grids, especially as we move more and more towards variable renewables, we need smarter load control strategies. We need improved building efficiency. And more specifically, we need more efficient space heating, which can allow us to turn space heating into a more flexible load. So those are some common themes, and I will leave the presentation there and open the forum to questions and comments.
Got a hand up from Stefan. Janet, are you going to share it?
Yeah. Well, we could start with Stefan, seeing as his hand was up first.
Thank you, Mike and Dominic. I think you get the analysis right. I like still to, as a comment, and then I have 2 questions. A short comment. I think we need to differentiate a little bit between more experienced, more innovative, more sophisticated grid companies, transmission system operators, and others. I'm not defending Europe here, but my feeling is my experiences, and I had been 10 years the chairperson of RGI, the Renewable Grid Initiative. We work together as NGOs with grid operators in Europe. That in Europe we are on a better path in several countries than, let's say, in many emerging economies, but also as in the US. For a variety of reasons. Not that we are perfect, by no means. But the reason why we did not have major grid breakdowns was that with common regulation, unbundling, legal unbundling between utilities and transmission, between production and transmission, the system operators had been forced to follow certain rules. And we have seen this, that in regions, in particular in Northwest Europe, where we have high variable renewables, particularly wind, in many seasons, we had up to 100% variable renewables in the system. Solar in the summer, wind in the winter. There was never any great outage because it was of good management, good preparation, good forecasting, good computer technology by the grid companies. Many of the grid companies, I can mention 50 Hertz or Telia or Tennet. Many of those grid companies employ now more IT persons than they do engineers. It's quite interesting to see that development, because they work with modern technologies to detect weather systems in a short time, to predict what will be happen, and then to manage the load in the system. Of course, that does not prevent from that the grid might be mechanically failing. The 2 biggest effects we had in Europe, and Mike, you might remember this one, the 2 biggest blackouts we had quite a while back. And when one was in Sweden, when suddenly in the entire so-called Nord Pool area, connecting a couple of countries in the Northern Hemisphere, completely failed for 2-3 days. So Vattenfall, the then Swedish utility, and others blamed immediately the high share of wind energy in Denmark, which was bullshit. The reason was a nuclear power station in Sweden, again, large scale, almost 1 gigawatt, boom, went out because there was a failure, had to be switched down immediately, and then we had to underload. And this affected all the other countries. It was a rolling thing. So that was something, the first misinformation. As you said, Mike, certain people then like to blame the variable renewables. The second thing we have seen in Europe was the rolling blackouts in Italy, from the north to the south, from the Alpine region to Sicily. It was in 2007, I remember, if I remember correctly. The reason was that, quite interesting, Italy had voted, population had voted whether Italy should build nuclear. This was back in the 1990s, and they had said no. But Italy had a gap of about 30% electricity. What they did, they bought cheap nuclear power from France. And this was brought over Switzerland into Italy. Now there was a big storm in the Alps, and a huge high kilowatt voltage transmission grid was destroyed because there were a couple of trees falling over, boom, out. And this was a rolling blackout. They had no backup. They had no decentralized secondary grids involved, no better management in place. And then everyone blamed, again, renewables, which was basically a failure of the Italian government to develop a system which is a little bit more decentralized with the grids, and which avoids to be just dependent on one single transmission grid line from France to provide 30% of electricity. I think that's important to keep in mind for legislation. We didn't have that again. So my question to you is, Mike, and to Dominic, would you be able at some point in time to also look into power outages and blackouts in developing countries? I think there the situation is even more dire, simply because the grid situation is even worse. It's not existing in many cases. So blackouts or outages are the permanent situation, or the normal situation, unfortunately. So what needs to be done there to avoid that they repeat the mistakes many of us have done in the developed countries? And the second point is, how can we bring the grid issues more to a public understanding that it's not just about building more renewable variable sources with solar and wind, which is very important, of course, but we need to pay same attention to proper working grid infrastructure, both high voltage grid and low voltage grid, to make that stuff happening in a reliable, affordable, and sustainable way. Thank you.
Hello, Stefan.
Hello, Mike. Long time no see, my friend.
Nice to see you. So in terms of the, sorry, Janet, did you have a comment?
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to find out, would you prefer to take, there's another question again from Sean, or will you answer after each question? Either is fine.
I don't know how Dominic feels. I probably quickly respond to Stefan and then go to the next question if that's okay with you.
All right. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So Stefan, in terms of quickly, because we are going to run up against time here. The developing countries question is an interesting one. Emerging economies. Of course, there are not that many cases right now where to the extent there would be a grid problem, that there's much in the way of penetration of variable renewables to be blamed. But of course, that will come, hopefully. I mean, Pakistan is the most recent example, major load curtailment event just a couple of weeks ago. We don't know yet what caused that. I've speculated with some of the Pakistani experts that similar to the case that you described in Italy, and also similar to what happened in the Great Northeast blackout of 2003, was you had a major loss of a critical transmission facility due to what's referred to as poor vegetation management by the grid operator, where trees, shrubbery, et cetera, are allowed to grow in, under, and around a major transmission facility. And when a major weather event hits, especially a high heat event, you get high voltage transmission lines droop, actually physically exaggerated droop, and they come in contact with vegetation, they short out. And when you have a situation like in Italy or like in South Australia, in the South Australia event we described, you have a weak interconnection between regions, and when that destabilizes, it can take the whole system down. And that's probably what happened in Pakistan. There's weak north-south transmission interregional connections between North and South Pakistan. The South is heavy in generation. The North is short of generation. There was a loss of major transmission facility between the two. System became destabilized. System operator was overwhelmed. Their voltage and frequency management processes failed to keep up, and they lost the system, or large parts of the system. So, this gets to your second point, your second question, which is in terms of getting more focus on this. I mean, one of the things that I'm frequently hammering on about is that we don't use common sets of metrics between how we gauge the reliability of transmission and distribution system and how we gauge the adequacy of generation resources. And we actually apply a standard to the adequacy of generation resources that is literally orders of magnitude more conservative than the implied standards that we observe for the reliability of the distribution system. And so while the standard that's applied certainly in post-industrial economies for resource adequacy amounts to, we use a metric in the distribution level called SAIDI, and SAIFI is, as I think you're aware, system average generation interruption duration index and system average interruption frequency index. And in many, many European systems, those tend to be in the 10 to 50 minute per customer per year range, largely because most of those systems at the distribution level have been undergrounded and therefore much more reliable in the face of weather events. In much of the North American market, it's more in the 100 to 200 minute per customer per year range. The point being that if we take the standards that are applied for generation adequacy and translate them into that same metric, we are literally talking about a standard that is tens of seconds to, a minute or two per customer per year of interruptions. So we're throwing huge buckets of money, primarily at fossil-fired generators, on the premise that we need more and more generation to avoid these events, when in fact, the first 15 or 20 things you would spend money on if you applied the common metric to improve customer experience of reliability are in the distribution and transmission system, both in expanding it, in reinforcing it, in hardening it against these events, and in improving the management and maintenance of those systems. So I don't know how we succeed in getting that narrative across, but I think it's, I think it would be much more apparent if we were to apply a common set of metrics to how we gauge the average customer's experience of service quality and service reliability. So those are my responses to your questions. I don't know if Dominic has anything to add. If not, we'll go on to the other question.
Okay, so we have another hand up from Sean. Sean, you can go ahead.
Hi guys, my name's Sean. I work for E3G. I am on the fossil fuel transition team. Really interesting talk. Thank you very much, Dominic and Michael. I just wanted to ask a bit more about the holding lines that you were kind of suggesting. So in the aftermath of these outage events, obviously there's an information vacuum, and the fossil fuel lobby and their allies will definitely try and occupy that space and give their reasoning. So I was just wondering how you might suggest countering those narratives, and if you could explain a bit more about those holding lines that you talk about in the toolkit, I think that'd be very helpful.
Dominic, I don't know if you wanted to respond. I think we offered those holding lines, but to be perfectly frank, I mean RAP is not. We have a communications group and they're very good, but RAP is not kind of an advocacy organization per se. I would be interested actually in the wake of the substantive information in the toolkit, what kind of holding lines you folks would come up with that you think would be effective in dealing with media, with public responses. I mean, I think, Stefan's questions point to an area that I think is, you can almost always safely go to in these events, which is to point the finger back at fossil-fired thermal generators and grid operators. And sometimes, in what I would refer to as minor incidents, like the incident in California, which was less than 3% of total demand curtailed for about an hour on the first day and about a half an hour on the second day. The UK event was similar, about 2% of demand curtailed for about 45 minutes. I would call those relatively minor events. Certainly from an individual customer's perspective, you'd hardly notice it compared to the events that you suffer due to distribution system interruptions. But in those events, I think it's also possible to point the finger at system operators without being accusatory, in the sense that, pardon my French, but shit happens sometimes. I mean, these are very complex systems. And the standards that we apply for reliability assume that once every great while, system operators will be overwhelmed by circumstances. And sometimes there's nobody to blame per se, quote unquote. There are things that the system operator could have done better and should in future. But in a case like Texas, of course, it was pretty quick. You could pretty quickly realize or determine that they were very quick to point to the fact like 30% of the wind fleet was out of service. But the ERCOT plan for a severe winter storm was for about 22% of the system of wind generators to be out of service due to freezing or other issues, which is an issue we need to address because, of course, in the northern part of North America, in the Northeast, wind turbine generators are much better winterized. But the fact was that only about 10% of the shortfall against plan was from wind generation. Put differently, had we not had 50% of the thermal generating fleet gone out of service, nobody would have even noticed the shortfall in wind generation. And you could have figured that out pretty quickly, which is why we hope the usefulness of the checklist to start going down through this as information becomes available, working through the checklist and trying to develop, a good fact-based narrative, counter narrative to what's going on. But it's almost always grid operators, fuel supply problems, freeze-ups in the natural gas transmission and production system, or failure of thermal generating plant, or as I said, in Europe, a failure over this past year of nuclear and hydro.
Sean, Janet's just projecting that the holding lines that we have in the paper. Mike mentioned the holding line, which I'm going to paraphrase as things happen. We don't have that in there because it's not much good. You don't want to go on TV and a whole load of people are freezing cold and you go, well, things happen. So that's not there. What we have is that history, a review of all the suggests that the vast majority of supply losses are basically problems with wires. It's really got very little to do with renewables. The other is that the case studies show that fossil fuel apologists are very quick to point the finger at renewables, but in each of those cases, it's been shown to be verifiably untrue. And then the other is, well, these are actually slightly pointing fingers at system operation and policymakers. It's basically saying if there is a problem that you see, it may be to some extent poor system operation or poor oversight. It could be that policymakers haven't really been proactive in accommodating renewables with supportive policies. So those are the holding lines that we suggest at the moment, and they are in the paper itself.
Okay, thanks, guys.
To Dominic's point, stuff happens is not the line you would use, but it might shape the way you frame the story about this being a system operator issue, right? That we don't know yet what happened in this instance, but in every high-profile outage we've seen over the past few years, a major contributing factor is that the system operator could have done better, and we know how they could have done better.
Well, because that's the thing, because you are still operating in that moment in an information vacuum, so I'd be reluctant to then point fingers at the system operators. But if you can say from past experience and past post-outage analyses, we have determined that this is a key trend, and it's very often not renewable penetration that's a problem; it's mismanagement or lack of best practices, essentially.
Well, yeah, it's basically never been. The fact in a couple of cases where there are a lot of renewables operating on the system. At the time, makes system operation a little different from what it would have been 20 years ago. But that doesn't mean there aren't industry best practices that would have allowed them to work through the situation without any interruption of load at all. So it's not to say that variable renewables don't change the job of system operators a little bit from what it once was. But simply to say that in every one of these instances over recent years where there's been a high-profile outage, whether it was a system with a lot of renewables operating at the time or not many renewables operating at the time, the point is that that they could have done better, and we know how they could have done better, and that's we don't know yet what happened in this instance, but that's probably going to turn out to be the case.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Sean.
Are there any other questions? I see one in the Q&A tab. And Stefan, I'm not sure whether that's a new hand or an old hand as well.
That's a new hand.
All right. So I think the one in the Q&A has already been spelled out by Dominic. So I don't know, maybe you want to take Stefan and then answer both.
Right, it's a short one. Thanks, Janet. I'd like to go back to the developing country issues. I think there's more than the basically reaction to outages, power failures, blackouts, resulting from poor management, resulting from poor maintenance. I think the point is that when governments in the South start to build up their renewable energy power system, they might think and must think transmission and distribution first, right? I mean, I see this in India, where India has, thankfully, very strong renewable energy targets for solar and for wind, significantly ones. The point is, it's stagnating. One reason is a completely inefficient grid system, which I have not considered. The second thing is no interconnectors between the states. That's the reason why it's stagnating. But there are issues before you even have the chance to get a blackout. You need to make your power system, your transmission grid system, your distribution grid system failure proof. I'm not saying you can avoid all failures. There will be challenges. I fully agree. But those can be completely reduced. And if we do not get the grid system right from the very beginning, I think the expansion of renewable energy will be very, very expensive, will be unreliable and unaffordable for customers. I think we need to keep this in mind. Also as NGOs, those things go together, that they are packaged. And then comes storage on top, etc., etc. I think we need to think in those systems. And I think we need to work with grid operators and with politicians to have this kind of complex components bundled, brought together, and then implemented together, in particular in countries where the grid system currently is not yet fully developed. Thank you.
Yeah, no, all good points, Stefan. In fact, I mean, you're sort of hearkening back to our favorite projects, Roadmap 2050, right? And it's still the case today. I mean, we've just had a recent study come out of Princeton University, the Net Zero America project. And, you know, if you look objectively at what's the best thing you can do to make 90% of the challenges associated with integrating a lot of renewables into the system go away? It's, you know, the top 10 things have to do with transmission and distribution. You know, and everybody loves to talk about storage and long duration storage and battery storage, and that's all very nice. And we're going to need some of that. But first and foremost, you need a transmission system that is architectured on the assumption, you know, on different assumptions than the way you set up transmission systems 50 years ago. And we're way behind in doing that. And it's not just in India and Pakistan. You know, I mean, I think Europe is actually finding out the hard way that a transmission system that was very well suited, extremely well suited to a resource portfolio dominated by coal and nuclear, is starting to get, it's still very reliable, but it's starting to get very costly to run as we're having to site more and more production in places where the resource is very good rather than close to load. So you see now mounting every year more and more redispatch costs on the system. It's a problem that could be made to go away tomorrow very cheaply by reinforcing and expanding some of the transmission system in Europe. But you know, sometimes transmission can be difficult to build sometimes. But it's a very relatively low cost solution, and just better management of the transmission system is a very low cost solution, and it's almost always overlooked.
Thank you, Mike. And Dominic, I don't know whether you want to add anything or.
Well, really, I just add that, if there are any other networks or platforms or parties that you think we can present this to, would be very interested in hearing that.
Okay, thanks for that. There's still a question on the chat, on the Q&A tab. The participant is wanting to know the meaning of farm dispatchable.
Firm dispatchable. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's a traditional wholesale power system term. It refers to, dispatchable refers to the ability to direct a power generation facility to turn on, turn off, or to ramp up or ramp down at a given time. So we've long sort of treated fossil fired thermal generation as dispatchable. We call it dispatchable because the assumption is that when you need it to turn up, you can tell it to turn up. When you need it to turn down, you can tell it to turn down. People sometimes refer to nuclear as dispatchable, and technically it is, but of course it's extremely inflexible economically. So you can tell a nuclear plant to turn up and turn down, but you don't want to do it very often or you'll end up breaking the plant. And people sometimes do argue that variable renewables are not dispatchable, but of course they can be to some extent. You can tell a wind farm or a grid connected solar facility to turn down its production if you need it to, and sometimes you do. If you think you're going to need fast ramping in the next couple of hours because there's a weather system coming in, or because the sun's going to go down and you're going to lose some of your solar production, you can direct generators, including wind power generators, to reduce their production in advance of that, so that if needed, they can ramp production back up. Again, assuming that the potential wind energy is there. So that's dispatchable. Firm refers to the extent to which at any given day, 24/7, 365, you have access to this dispatchability. And, of course, wind and solar, at least in terms of primary energy availability, are often referred to as variable or sometimes intermittent, is a way that they're referred to, which basically means that the availability of the primary energy source, solar energy or wind energy, is to some extent stochastic. It's random. Solar is, predictable in terms of when the sun comes up and goes down, but you have clouds and snowstorms and so on and so forth. The problem is that's not the problem. We can all understand that. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, blah 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 blah. The usual fossil industry nonsense. The fact is, the gas doesn't always flow, and the coal isn't always unfrozen. And the gas-fired power plant and the coal-fired power plant sometimes just freeze up. Or when it's really, really hot, gas-fired generators can't produce as much as they can when it's not hot. And when there's a drought, nuclear plants can't operate, because many nuclear plants can't operate because there's not enough cooling water available in the river to cool them off. Or if, like in South Africa, where it's very common to use air-cooled systems for nuclear plants, the air is just too hot. And there's not enough opportunity to dump heat into the ambient air system. So, you'll often hear the fossil generating industry or the nuclear industry say that, yeah, well, the problem with wind and solar is the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, whereas we're firm, we're always there. Baloney. And what we're finding is even where individual plants might be able to claim that they are available, 88, 92, 94% of the time, when needed, we're finding, especially now with increasing weather events, extreme weather events, and increasing reliability on attenuated fuel supply chains, that there are large correlation factors. And so there's a recent study that came out for the PJM system in the US that showed that while system operators are assuming that gas-fired combined cycle plants are available 92% of the time, because individual plants can typically achieve that outcome, they're finding that when you actually attribute correlation events to the population of gas-fired combined cycle plants, their reliable capacity is probably more like about 76% of the time, which starts to make them look a lot less firm than the fossil industry has traditionally claimed. So, but that's what firm dispatchable refers to. It refers to this claim by the what you'll hear the fossil industry often say, or the nuclear industry often say, which is, yeah, but our stuff is firm and dispatchable. Well, you can very credibly challenge both of those claims.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that. And Dominic as well. I see you're muted. Would you want to add anything? Okay, all right. So thank you both so much, and thank you for all those questions from the participants as well. I think we'll not take any more of your time. We're already over the time. So mine will just to say thank you. We've shared the toolkit again on the chat and the email addresses of both our speakers and authors here. Feel free to reach out to them directly in case that's necessary for you. Otherwise, we hope to engage further on this conversation. And we hope that you engage also with the toolkit, and please share it widely. It will be very useful to other colleagues as well who did not manage to make it today. And yeah, with that, I will close this so that everybody can get on with their day. Thank you very much again, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you,
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.